Hey guys, tonight let's do something very difficult by modern standards. Let's slow down. Dim the lights. Put the phone face down. Yes, I know, brave choice. Get comfortable, maybe under a blanket that has absolutely no Wi-Fi capability, and let's gently drift back to an America that existed before the internet, before notifications, before doom scrolling, before anyone knew what a loading bar was, because nothing loaded, ever. It just existed, eventually. This is not a story about heroism or innovation. It's mostly a story about waiting. Waiting for information. Waiting for people to call back. Waiting for the newspaper to show up. Waiting for the weather forecast to be wrong again. And waiting in lines. So many lines. America before the internet was not faster, it was not simpler, it was just quieter and oddly confident about being wrong. So let's ease into it. In the early and mid-20th century, information in America moved like a polite guest. It knocked first. Sometimes it never showed up, and if it did, it arrived late and slightly inaccurate, but everyone pretended that was fine. News came from newspapers, actual paper, printed overnight by machines that sounded like industrial panic attacks. The morning paper landed on your porch with a soft thud, like a mildly disappointed cat, and whatever it said was reality for the entire day. If the paper said it was going to rain, you carried an umbrella. If it didn't rain, that was your fault for trusting the paper too much. There was no refreshing the page, no checking 5 other sources, no comment section where strangers argued about clouds. You read what you got, and then you folded it neatly, or angrily, and moved on. Radio was king for a long time. The radio spoke, and America listened. Families gathered around it in the evening, sitting quietly as if the radio might notice disrespect. The voice coming out of that box was treated like an authority figure, not because it was always right, but because it sounded confident, which, honestly, is still how most misinformation works. The radio told people about wars, elections, baseball games, and weather patterns that may or may not have existed, and Americans trusted it because the alternative was asking your neighbor, who believed in ghosts and suspicious pigeons. Then came television. Black and white at first, which meant reality looked serious even when it wasn't. Television did not ask for attention, it demanded it. 3 channels, maybe 4 if you lived somewhere fancy, and that was it. No recommendations, no algorithms, just whatever the networks decided you were emotionally ready to see. If nothing good was on, you watched it anyway, because what else were you going to do? Think? Before the internet, shared experiences were unavoidable. Everyone watched the same shows, everyone heard about the same scandals, everyone knew the same jingles and commercials, even if they hated them. If something happened, everyone knew about it. Eventually, usually the next morning, possibly 2 days later, depending on weather and vibes. And this created a strange national rhythm. Days had pauses built into them. Moments where nothing happened, where you waited. You waited for letters, actual letters, paper envelopes with stamps, messages that took days, sometimes weeks to arrive. And when they did, they were usually short because postage was expensive, and nobody wanted to write a novel by hand unless they were emotionally unwell. A letter arriving was an event. You held it. You wondered what was inside. You didn't immediately assume it was bad news or spam. Sometimes it was just a letter. Phone calls were another adventure. If someone didn't answer, you just accepted it. They were unavailable, possibly gone forever. You left a message with whoever picked up, often a child, sometimes a confused grandparent, occasionally a dog, metaphorically speaking. And that was it. You waited. There was no texting to clarify tone, no just checking in, no typing bubbles. Silence was normal, and silence didn't automatically mean something was wrong. It just meant people were busy being offline, which was all the time. Entertainment moved slowly, too. If you missed a TV show, you missed it. There was no replay, no streaming, no clips uploaded 5 minutes later. You either saw it live or relied on someone else's explanation, which was always inaccurate. Yeah, it was good, they'd say. It was about a guy. Something happened. Music was physical. You owned it. Records, tapes, later CDs that scratched if you looked at them the wrong way. If you wanted to hear a song, you waited for the radio to play it. And when it finally did, you stopped everything. Talking, breathing, existing. Because if you missed it, that was on you. Libraries were sacred spaces, quiet, dusty, filled with the smell of paper and unspoken judgment. If you wanted to research something, you went there. You looked it up manually. Index cards, card catalogs, tiny drawers that slid open like they were hiding secrets. Research took hours, sometimes days, and at the end you were only mostly sure you were right, which was acceptable because everyone else was also mostly sure. Before the internet, facts had weight because they were harder to get. Not always true facts, just harder-earned ones. Rumors spread slower, but they spread deeper. A weird story could live in a town for decades completely unchallenged. There was no quick search to ruin it. Someone said a building was haunted. Okay, it's haunted now. Forever. Someone claimed their cousin knew a guy who met Elvis. Sure, why not? Memory mattered more. People remembered phone numbers, addresses, birthdays, directions that included phrases like, "Turn left where the old tree used to be." And somehow, it mostly worked. Work life moved differently, too. Offices were filled with paper, stacks of it, filing cabinets that felt emotionally threatening. If you wanted to send a document, you faxed it. A machine screamed at another machine across the country, and everyone agreed this was progress. Mistakes were permanent. If you typed something wrong, you retyped the whole page, carefully, quietly, with resentment. But there was less urgency. Deadlines existed, yes, but nobody expected instant replies. Nobody panicked if you didn't respond within minutes. Time stretched. Even boredom had space to breathe. Kids were bored constantly, and that boredom created strange skills, like memorizing cereal box ingredients or staring out a car window for hours, watching the world slide by without commentary. No screens in the back seat, just vibes and occasional existential questions. America before the internet was not better, it was not worse, it was just different. People were more patient and also more confidently wrong. They trusted fewer sources, but trusted them deeply. And in that slower, quieter world, life unfolded without being documented in real time. Moments happened, and then they were gone. And somehow, that felt normal.
The long wait, when everyday life took its time. America, before the internet, had a very specific relationship with time. Not a healthy one, but a committed one. Everything took longer, and everyone accepted that as a basic law of the universe, like gravity or bad coffee at gas stations. If you wanted directions, you didn't open a map app, you asked someone, usually a stranger, usually confidently wrong. They'd pause, squint, point vaguely, and say something like, "Go down there, maybe 3 lights or 4, then turn where the pharmacy used to be." And you thanked them, sincerely, because that was the system. Travel itself was slower, but felt bigger. Road trips were events, actual events. Families packed sandwiches like they were preparing for a mild expedition. Paper maps unfolded across dashboards like giant, angry origami projects. Someone always held the map upside down, someone always blamed someone else, and everyone eventually stopped pretending they knew where they were. But that was fine. Being lost was part of it. Gas stations were information hubs. You asked for directions, you checked the weather, you overheard conversations that made you slightly uncomfortable. Motels had vacancy signs that flickered like they were emotionally unstable. You pulled over when you were tired, not when an app told you it was optimal. Time bent. Schedules were suggestions. Shopping was also slower and somehow louder. If you wanted something, you went to a store, physically. You walked aisles. You touched things. You compared items based on vibes and packaging. There were no reviews, no star ratings, just trust and regret. You bought a toaster because the box looked confident, and if it broke, you complained to friends, not the internet, because the internet was not there to listen. Customer service meant talking to a person, a real one, with a voice and emotions. Returns were awkward. You stood at the counter explaining yourself like you were on trial, and the cashier judged you silently, which felt fair. Money moved slowly, too. Paychecks were physical. You deposited them in person. Banks closed early, because apparently money also needed rest. If something went wrong, you waited. There was no checking status updates, no tracking numbers, just patience or mild panic. Social life had more space. Plans were made in advance, often days ahead, sometimes weeks. You couldn't cancel last minute with a vague text. You had to call and explain, which required commitment. So people showed up more, not because they wanted to, but because it was socially expensive not to. If someone didn't arrive, you worried, genuinely. Not "they ghosted me" worried, but "should we check hospitals" worried, because silence meant something different then. Dating was slower too, and more confusing. You met people through friends or work or places where humans existed physically. You didn't know everything about them immediately. You learned things gradually, over time, sometimes years later. Red flags took longer to appear, which was both charming and deeply unfortunate. Breakups happened face-to-face or by phone, or in truly dramatic cases by letter. There was no subtweeting, no vague posting, just mutual friends choosing sides quietly. News cycles moved at a human pace. A story broke, people talked about it for days, sometimes weeks. There wasn't a new outrage every 10 minutes. There was time to fully misunderstand one thing before moving on to the next. This made scandals feel heavier. They lingered. When something big happened, it sat with people. They discussed it at work, at dinner, on the phone with relatives. Opinions formed slowly, and once formed, they stuck around, like furniture no one wanted to move. Politics felt distant, not less intense, just farther away. You saw politicians on TV occasionally, read about them in the paper, and that was enough. There was no constant access, no endless commentary, just occasional updates and a lot of assumptions. Weather forecasts were famously unreliable, but still respected. If the TV said snow, schools closed preemptively, and nobody questioned it. If the snow didn't come, that was fine. You enjoyed the day off. Truth was flexible. Even emergencies felt different. You found out about disasters after they happened, sometimes long after. There was shock, but not the constant exposure. Images were limited. Details were filtered. This distance made tragedy feel quieter, still real, but less consuming. And through all of this, there was waiting. Waiting for news, waiting for calls, waiting for letters, waiting for things to arrive, waiting for life to unfold at its own pace. People filled that waiting with habits. They watched out windows, they listened to the radio, they read the same newspaper twice, they thought. And thinking, unstructured and uninterrupted, was common, which explains a lot, actually. America before the internet didn't feel empty. It felt full of pauses, and those pauses shaped everything. The way people spoke, the way they planned, the way they remembered. Life wasn't documented constantly. It was experienced, then talked about later, often inaccurately. But that was okay, because memory, like information, was slower then, and nobody expected perfection. They just expected time.
American homes before the internet had a very specific sound. It wasn't silence, but it wasn't constant noise either. It was the hum of appliances, the tick of clocks, the low murmur of a television that no one was actively watching. The TV was on, always on, not because anyone cared, but because silence felt suspicious. Evenings followed rituals. Dinner happened at roughly the same time every day. Not because of productivity, but because hunger was predictable. Families sat together, sometimes talking, sometimes not. Both were acceptable. After dinner, dishes were washed by hand or loaded into dishwashers that sounded like they were struggling emotionally. Then people drifted toward the living room. Television schedules ruled the night. You didn't ask, "What do you want to watch?" You asked, "What's on?" And what was on was final. Commercials were part of life. Not interruptions, just moments. You watched them. You memorized them. You sang along to jingles without realizing it. Advertisements didn't chase you. They waited patiently. And when they appeared, they were oddly comforting. Late-night TV felt special, a little forbidden. The tone softened. Voices dropped. Everything slowed down. You didn't binge. You lingered. If you missed an episode, that was it. The story moved on without you, which taught people an important lesson early. Life does not wait. Phones in the house were anchored. They lived on walls or tables. You stretched the cord into other rooms, whispering like you were committing a crime. Privacy was negotiated physically. If the phone rang during dinner, everyone froze, because calls were intentional. No one called accidentally. No one butt-dialed. If someone rang, they meant it. An answering machine arrived and felt revolutionary and slightly eerie. A recorded voice capturing messages felt like a small miracle or a small threat. You replayed messages carefully, sometimes repeatedly, analyzing tone like it was a literary text. Home life included boredom, a lot of it. Kids sprawled on floors, adults stared at walls, pets judged everyone silently. Board games came out. Arguments followed. Someone always cheated on Monopoly, and everyone knew who it was. Reading was common. Not productive reading, just reading. Books were entertainment, not content. You didn't skim, you sank in. Magazines stacked up in bathrooms, dentist offices, waiting rooms. You read things you would never search for, articles you didn't choose, which exposed you to ideas accidentally. That doesn't happen much anymore. News entered the house in scheduled bursts. The evening news came on, and everyone knew when. You didn't catch it later. You caught it then, or not at all. Anchors spoke calmly, seriously, like the world was heavy but manageable. Disasters were delivered gently. No dramatic music, no constant updates, just information. Then a weather segment, then sports, and then it was over. After that, the night stretched open. People talked, or didn't. They thought about things, or avoided thinking about them. There was no second screen, no scrolling while watching. Attention was divided differently. Sometimes people just sat, which sounds strange now, but it was normal then. Weekends felt longer. Stores closed early, sometimes entirely. Sunday was quiet, almost aggressively so. Nothing demanded your attention, nothing buzzed, nothing updated. You existed in time without checking it constantly. Photos were rare and precious. You didn't document everything, you chose moments. Cameras were physical, film was expensive, mistakes mattered. You didn't see photos immediately, you waited.
And when they came back, weeks later, they felt like memories solidified, even the bad ones. Mistakes stayed. Eyes closed, blurry frames. You kept them anyway. Home movies were events. A camcorder came out. Everyone stiffened. Those tapes were watched years later, awkwardly, lovingly. Nothing was deleted. Home life had friction, but it also had rest. There were gaps where nothing happened, and no one felt the need to fill them. Even loneliness felt different. It wasn't broadcast, it wasn't shared. It was quiet, personal, and often temporary. America before the internet spent a lot of time at home, with itself, with others, with nothing in particular. And in those quiet evenings, without realizing it, people learned how to sit with time.
School in America before the internet ran on an unspoken agreement. The agreement was simple. The teacher knew things, the students did not, and no one could instantly check. This gave teachers an almost mystical authority. If a fact was written on the chalkboard, it was true. Not because it always was, but because questioning it required effort. Textbooks were old, sometimes very old, with maps that quietly lied, statistics that had expired years ago, and photos that looked like they were taken during a dust storm. But they were official, which mattered. If you wanted more information, you went to the library, or you didn't. Those were the options. Group projects meant actually meeting, in person, at someone's house, where parents hovered suspiciously. Research involved copying things by hand or typing them carefully. Mistakes hurt. Plagiarism still existed, but it took dedication. School days ended without digital homework portals. You wrote assignments down or forgot them, and forgetting was final. College was similar, just louder. Professors lectured, students scribbled notes desperately. No recordings, no replays. If you missed class, you borrowed notes from someone else, who may or may not have paid attention. Office hours involved walking into a room and talking, which filtered out many questions automatically. Work life followed similar rhythms. Offices were quieter, not peaceful, just less frantic. Email did not exist yet, which meant fewer misunderstandings and fewer passive-aggressive sentences ending in "per my last message." Communication took effort. You had to stand up or pick up a phone. Meetings happened face-to-face. People arrived with folders and opinions. Decisions took longer, but once made, they stuck. Paper ruled everything. Memos circulated, printed, read, filed. If you wanted to change something, you reprinted it, which discouraged impulsive edits. Mistakes lingered, which encouraged thinking first. Jobs stayed in one place. You worked where the work was. Remote work was science fiction, and honestly, a little terrifying. If you wanted a job, you dressed up. You went somewhere, you handed someone a resume on paper, and then you waited. Weeks passed. Silence meant no. There was no online rejection email, just emotional closure through absence. Careers moved slower. People stayed at jobs for years, decades, not because they loved them, but because change was inconvenient, and inconvenience is a powerful stabilizer. Information at work was limited. You knew what you needed to know, and not much more. You didn't see company gossip unfold in real time. You heard about it later, usually distorted. Rumors traveled by hallway, not algorithm. This made them feel more personal and sometimes more dangerous. Mistakes at work were local. You messed up, a few people noticed. It didn't live forever online, which made failure survivable. Learning happened slowly. You didn't look it up, you asked someone. And asking required humility, which shaped people. Expertise was respected because it was rare and visible. Not everyone had a platform. Most people had a desk. School and work existed in defined spaces. You left them, and they stayed behind. There was no checking email at midnight because there was no email. There was just tomorrow. And tomorrow felt far away, but manageable.
America before the internet didn't feel informed, it felt guided. You trusted institutions, not blindly, but by necessity. And in that environment, not knowing everything was normal, even expected, which took pressure off. You were allowed to be uninformed, temporarily, sometimes permanently, and life moved on anyway.
News in America before the internet arrived in waves. Gentle ones, predictable ones. Morning paper, evening broadcast, maybe a radio update in between. That was it. There was no constant stream, no alerts breaking into your day, no sense that you were already behind before breakfast, because you couldn't be behind. There was nowhere to catch up to. Anchors and journalists acted like gatekeepers, not curators. Gatekeepers. They decided what mattered, and by default, what didn't. This created a shared national focus. When something big happened, everyone knew about the same version of it. They might disagree about what it meant, but they agreed it existed. Cultural moments were unavoidable. If a song topped the charts, you heard it repeatedly, whether you wanted to or not. If a movie was popular, everyone had seen it or planned to. If a celebrity did something strange, it became dinner conversation, not trending content. Fame felt distant. Celebrities lived on screens and magazines. They weren't constantly accessible. You didn't know their thoughts in real time. You didn't see their breakfast. Mystery survived, and because of that, disappointment took longer. Sports were communal experiences. Games aired at specific times. You planned around them. Missed plays were discussed afterward, not replayed endlessly. Radio commentators became voices of trust. You believed them because you had no alternative. Political speeches were events. You watched them live or read about them later. There was no instant analysis, no fact-checking scrolls beneath the screen. Just words, delivered, absorbed. This made politics feel slower, but also heavier. Opinions formed over time, not overnight. Protests happened without viral videos, and yet they still mattered, because presence mattered more than visibility. Pop culture spread through physical things, posters, albums, T-shirts. Identity wasn't performed online. It was worn, literally. Subcultures found each other through magazines, record stores, word of mouth, which meant belonging required effort. Trends moved slowly. Haircuts stayed popular for years, sometimes too long. Fashion mistakes lingered, and no one could delete evidence. Comedy was shared live. Jokes traveled by retelling, which softened them and filtered out the worst ones. Late-night hosts shaped humor gently, night after night. There was time between laughs. Fear spread differently, too. Scares came from headlines, not feeds. You worried about things you'd been told to worry about, not everything at once. This limited anxiety, and also awareness. People didn't know everything that was happening everywhere, and they accepted that. Ignorance wasn't seen as failure, just distance. Culture felt thicker, heavier, less fragmented. There were fewer voices, but louder ones. And because everyone drank from the same stream, disagreements felt more contained. America argued, but it argued about the same things. And then, slowly, without announcement, that rhythm began to change. New machines appeared, quietly, in offices, in universities, boxes that connected to other boxes. And at first, no one noticed. They still read the paper, still watched the news, still waited. But something was shifting, and the waiting, slowly, began to disappear. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, America before the internet was still very much itself. But it had started to fidget. Nothing had exploded yet. Nothing had been disrupted. But there was a feeling, a low hum beneath daily life. Computers existed, but they were polite about it. They stayed on desks. They didn't follow you home. They didn't ask for your attention constantly. A computer turned on slowly, deliberately, like it was considering whether the effort was worth it. Most people used them for specific tasks, typing, accounting, games that looked like spreadsheets having an identity crisis. You didn't live inside a computer, you visited it. Modems began to appear, and they screamed. That sound, metallic, alien, like two robots arguing through a tin can. Connecting to anything required patience and courage. And when it worked, it didn't feel magical, it felt technical. Very few people thought, this will change everything. They thought, that's interesting. Daily life still ran on old rules. You still waited for the newspaper, still watched the evening news, still planned your day without checking traffic apps. Calendars were paper, contacts were handwritten, mistakes were crossed out, not erased. Malls were social centers. Teenagers didn't text, they wandered, they hung out, they leaned on railings, they existed publicly. Arcades buzzed, music stores thrived, video rental stores felt eternal. Friday nights meant wandering aisles of VHS tapes, hoping the movie you wanted wasn't already gone. Sometimes it was, and that disappointment shaped character. If you wanted to know something random, you wondered. You didn't immediately answer yourself. Curiosity had room to breathe. Arguments ended unresolved. Facts were debated endlessly, and sometimes wrong ideas lived on peacefully. This was frustrating, but it was also human. Time still belonged to people. Work stayed at work. School stayed at school. When you left a place, you were gone. Photos were still rare enough to matter. Moments passed undocumented, and somehow felt more complete because of it. People remembered how things felt, not how they looked. News still arrived with edges smoothed. Horrors were filtered. Joy was delayed. The world felt large, distant. Other countries existed mostly in headlines and maps, not in your pocket. And in that final stretch, before everything changed, America lived in a strange balance, connected enough to function, disconnected enough to rest. Nobody knew they were in the last quiet years. Nobody gathered to appreciate them. Nobody said goodbye. Life just kept going. And then, slowly, lines began to blur. Phones untethered themselves. Screens multiplied. Waiting shortened. Information stopped knocking. It started barging in. But that's another story. For now, we stay here, in the America before the Internet, where time stretched, silence existed, and nothing needed to be refreshed. And in that stillness, people slept.